Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Whether you are here for this terrific panel or simply trying to escape the heat and find some shade, we welcome you all the same. I'm Cristiano Lima. I cover tech policy for the Washington Post, and this will be my one shameless plug to subscribe to my Technology 202 newsletter, which you can find online. Really thrilled to be here today to have a perpetually timely discussion on content moderation, online safety, trust, and these issues that we see pop up in major debates around elections, around the war in Ukraine, around the pandemic, and pretty much every facet of society. And I'm thrilled to be joined by a terrific panel. We have today Adam Neufeld, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Impact Officer at the Anti-Defamation League. We have Steve Del Bianco, who is the CEO of industry trade group NetChoice. We have Barack Richmond, who is the Edgar P. and Elizabeth C. Bartlett Professor of Law and Business Administration at Duke University, and Shannon McGregor, who is an Assistant Professor and Senior Researcher at the Center for Information, Technology, and Public Life at the University of North Carolina. And so I was hoping to just start, and perhaps we can just go down the line, and I'd love to hear sort of how your work intersects with these issues around online safety, trust in digital platforms, and user choice. So would you like to get us started now?
Sure. Thanks so much, everyone. Is that working? So ADL works on a variety of issues that touch on this, and they're not always in the same direction. So we care a ton about harassment of vulnerable populations. We do an annual survey that found about a quarter of vulnerable population adults, as well as youth, have experienced some form of severe online harassment. So not just name calling, but something more severe. We also have a large 30-person team focused on extremism. So we care a lot about disinformation around hate, radicalization in both public and private spaces, and we care about democracy and civil rights more broadly. But we also care about freedom of expression, particularly rules that might have a disproportionate impact on non-majority people, religions, et cetera. And so I think as a result, this topic raises lots of hard questions in terms of philosophy, in terms of law, in terms of politics, and internal operations, right? Things like how to balance these different goals, what errors you're willing to tolerate or not willing to tolerate, who has responsibility to take action. But one of the things that we want to make clear is that actually there's tons of easy questions as well here and easy things to do. And that while we proceed on the hard questions, we should also get some of the easy things right. So things like, why is social media the only place where a victim of the services can't call and talk to somebody? Everywhere else you can do that. Why can a platform say that it's doing X, but when we audit it and provide, for example, we just sent 300 of the worst anti-Semitic posts to Twitter, why do they only take down 5% of those despite saying it? That same thing has happened with QAnon, militias, things like that. Why do they choose certain policies on private groups that are clearly not going to find hate? So there's a whole bunch of these kinds of easy things, and that has led us to not just want to participate in the hard questions, but also use advocacy, focus laws like the California Transparency Law, and other steps to try to get some of this easy stuff done so that we can at least get to a decent place.
Thanks, Cristiano. Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. So I run a trade association, and all of our members are listed on our website, and they're the leading e-commerce companies around the world. So I'm unique among the panel because Adam, Shannon, and Barack, they're sort of like the Defense Intelligence Agency or the Strategic Planning Group. But NetChoice, we're the Marines. We are agile, mobile, and hostile. And in the pursuit of our mission, and our mission is right on our website. For our benefit of my member companies, we're trying to make the internet safe for free enterprise and for free expression. Our companies are competing with each other and constantly trying to please the advertisers, the businesses that use their platform, and the end users, trying to keep the regulators happy. But mostly, NetChoice's perspective is to try to identify and disable ridiculous regulatory approaches or laws that might have had good intentions but would create ridiculous consequences. Just give you one quick example. Over the past 2 years, despite COVID travel restrictions, NetChoice and my team parachuted into nearly every single state capital. And in the red states, We had laws designed to punish Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube for kicking Donald Trump off on January the 6th by making it illegal to moderate that content. And Adam, you'll be glad to know that we lobbied against and actually sued Texas and Florida, whose laws would make it illegal for us to take down anti-Semitic hate speech because it's protected by the First Amendment. I'll grant you we don't catch it all, but we wouldn't be able to catch any under those laws. So in the blue states, it's the other extreme. Blue states are wanting even greater amounts of content moderation. So we have completely opposite aims in America right now. More content moderation versus less content moderation. And they cancel each other out here in Washington, D.C., but in the states, each goes their own way. I look forward to telling you more about the lawsuits later on, Christiana.
So I'm Barack Richmond. Usually when I'm compared to a part of the government, it's usually Congressional Research Service or the Bureau of Standards, something that nobody cares about or thinks about, and might not even be in existence anymore for all I know. But I am on this panel. I'm a professor of law and a professor of business, and one of my areas of expertise is antitrust policy. And I'm on this panel because of a working group that I was a part of. It was headed at Stanford University that proposed a particular solution. I think you call it a solution, certainly an intervention or a policy recommendation with the name middleware that maybe we'll talk about later. But by way of background, I was on that panel because of my background in antitrust policy. And this panel, this working group was created. It was formed by Francis Fukuyama, who many of you might know is a leading theorist on democracy, leading advocate and proponent of democratic freedoms across the world. And the perception was that we had the emergence of these large digital platforms, specifically Amazon, Facebook, Google, Twitter. The perception was that, that they represent a certain rise in economic power and would necessitate some kind of antitrust scrutiny, and that's why I was brought on the panel. In our deliberations, I think it's safe to characterize the following as one of our first conclusions, which is that these platforms do not so much raise concerns about economic power as they do about political power. To the degree that a Mark Zuckerberg can control what 130 million Americans can see, that raises at the very least a challenge to democratic freedom and the operation of a free democracy. At the same time, we're also very heedful and mindful of the First Amendment, not just as a set of principles, but also as a really core set of values that Steve and others have really worked very hard to embrace. So from that transition, from thinking about these platforms as the source of concentrated economic power to a source of political power that democracies simply need to reconcile and think about, consistent with First Amendment principles, that's how we arrived at our middleware solution, and that's how I arrived on the panel.
Great, thank you. So I'm sort of here, I guess, with two hats on. One of myself as a researcher who studies how, in particular, content moderation policies within platforms, impact political life. So how does it play out when content or ad content in particular is moderated by platforms for people running a political campaign, for example? And sort of understanding, my research has helped shed some light on the ways that those decisions are not always meted out in ways that are equitable. And also looking at the impact of content moderation policies on things like our democratic life and people's participation in politics. I think we've gone from, just in my rather short, I feel like, academic career. When I first entered academia as a PhD student, we were still at the sort of tail end of like, the internet is going to make democracy better, and this is it. Like, now we've figured it out. And now all of a sudden we're like, democracy's dying, and it's only because of the internet. And obviously, I think the truth is a little somewhere in the middle of that, right? They all interact with each other in the ways that some of the other panelists have already begun to talk about. But then I'm also here because I advised on a report that came out earlier this year from the Knight Foundation and Gallup, where we did a survey last summer of 10,000 Americans to ask them their views at these intersections of technology, social media, and democracy, and ask questions to try and figure out what type of regulation, what are people concerned about online, and what type of solutions do they see for that. And although, certainly here in Washington, we do see there are two solutions, right? At least, coming from different ends in terms of policymakers. But what our survey found was that only about 50% of Americans share the views of either, more content moderation from, government as well, or no content moderation at all. A full other half of the population has views about what they're concerned about online and what to do about it that are not necessarily reflected by political elites here in DC. And so I think that's sort of, interesting to think about as we're trying to come up with different ways to deal with the intersections that we're talking about. And, that necessitates sort of taking a pulse on what people are concerned about. We did find like a shared concern for just like, we're worried about what's going on social media, but we see deep divides, mostly along partisan lines in terms of what are we concerned about. If you're more conservative, you tend to be more concerned about you being too moderated, right, and speech being curtailed, whereas those who had, a more liberal ideology are more concerned about hate speech and bullying, and sort of, we can see sort of these two different mindsets play out in sort of the attitudes and worries that undergird these different sort of regulatory approaches that they support.
So I'm glad you mentioned that survey. I wanted to ground this conversation a little bit in some public opinion, and a couple of the findings in that survey that you advised on, Shannon, were that 90% of Americans believe social media makes it easier for harmful and extreme viewpoints to spread, and that 76% said that they distrust what they see. So Shannon, maybe you can start, and anyone feel free to jump in, but what do you see as some of the root causes of that?
Yeah, I mean...
To what extent do you think those perceptions are warranted?
That's a very good addendum to that question. I think that I'm pretty sure that Knight asked me to be an advisor on this iteration of the survey because they had done an earlier one shortly after the 2016 election. I think it came out in 2018, and one of the big findings was like, 1 in 4 Americans think that the election outcome was changed different than it would have been because of misinformation on social media. And myself and my colleagues were like, whoa. We research communication. It's actually really hard to change people's minds. And definitely a couple of Facebook posts are not going to be the thing to do it. So, my approach coming to this was that I thought that some of these concerns were overfounded. Not that these are things that we shouldn't be worried about, but, the idea that this many Americans were thinking the election was changed because of social media posts, is sort of, as a person who researches communication and political behavior, a sort of shocking assertion, right? That flies in the face of what we actually know about persuasion and how people's attitudes are changed. And so I think people still, though, have this perception, in large part because they experience misinformation online, but I think also because our public narrative has been around this a lot, in particular around political and social issues. We see a lot of press coverage of it. We see politicians talking about it on the Hill. From both sort of political perspectives, it's been politically advantageous to take the social media platforms and other large platforms to task, right? That's a popular sort of a line of attack, whether you're from the left or for the right. And so I think because of both the press coverage of it and political attention to it, that has made it maybe more salient in people's minds than it actually is. And one of the things that I pushed really hard for when we were designing this survey was to not just ask about what people are worried about and what harms they are experiencing. Because if we're experiencing all these horrible things, but none of us are leaving social media platforms, how can we help understand that? And the survey also found that, I think something like 80% of Americans say that being on social media makes it much easier for them to connect with friends and family. And we also asked about, when you see political and social debates online and on social media, does that make you more or less likely to engage in some political activities online? No, right? So when people see political and social debates online, they're like, I'm going to not be in this space. But we did find that it made them more likely to get involved in politics offline, right? So we are seeing these like pro-social and pro-civic benefits when we ask people about it. And I think that's just an important part of the conversation, especially when we think about solutions, whether they're internal or external for how we think about content moderation, is to not erase the real goods, both socially and civically, that people do report experiencing from their time online while trying to make it still a safer and healthier place from a democratic perspective as well.
Other thoughts on what's driving that and to what extent that perception is warranted from anyone else?
Yeah, I would suggest that we thought, as Shannon indicated, that the internet was going to bring us the Arab Spring. It was going to revolutionize the spread of democracy. It would allow us to share our own news and our own views without running them through a gatekeeper. And I got to say that when I got on Facebook for the first time and reconnected with high school and college friends and professional friends and family, it was a pretty pleasant experience. But something happened along the way. We became a dangerously divided country, not because of social media, but social media certainly made it easier to find ways to express your news and views in angry ways. But at least as much of our division is fed by the traditional media as it is amplified on social media. We pick your poison, right? Are you CNN or are you Fox? And it's one thing for Shannon to investigate what was the cause of some election dissatisfaction, but where did the perception come out that the election was illegitimate? Traditional media fed that storm, and that storm doesn't seem to be subsiding. One other trend would be that folks who had a certain viewpoint and wanted a certain kind of social media moderation could gravitate to new choices because there are no barriers to entry to starting a new social network. Parler, Gab, Rumble, MeWe, Truth Social. All of these were social media platforms that were launched, and it didn't require us to leave Twitter to join Truth Social or to join Parler. You could stay on multiple social media platforms. In other words, there wasn't a switching cost, even though you might not find as many of your friends in the new network. How has that experiment worked out? It's proven that there are choices, and TikTok today is the fastest growing social media platform. You express things on TikTok in a certain way. It may not be the way that all of us choose to do it, but it's growing and showing that the market responds to suit the needs. I do think that that is not a healthy trend if it's going to drive each of us to run to a silo that moderates to suit our views, and then we're not actually connecting in a way with others that might seek to counter our perceptions or offer a new perspective. We're going to need to return to a level of civility for that to happen. And that may happen on the new fringe social media platforms, or it may happen on the main ones. I hope it does.
So another finding that I think is pertinent, Adam, you mentioned the report that you guys recently released on online hate and harassment, which I believe is an annual report, right? And one of the findings was that harassment over time has hardly budged, and particularly among marginalized groups. What do you think that tells us about how platforms are responding to some of these different risks and issues that we're discussing?
Sure. I think that there's been more focus when it comes to disinformation and extremism. Not necessarily all not successful in really much, right? But rather than actually thinking about harassment. And I think it's important to recognize those things as kind of overlapping, but not the same. So for example, QAnon, right, has which was allowed to basically fester on all mainstream platforms until the day or 2 days after January 6th, and still has a decent amount on mainstream platforms, is very concerning from a hate perspective, from an extremism perspective, from a democracy perspective, and so on. From a harassment perspective, it's not as much. There definitely have been massive harassment targets, but it's not the same. It's not one of the main drivers of the percentages. So I think that we need to start thinking much more about harassment. And so that means things like a lot more user tools baked in to to technology right now, it's incredibly hard to make your online experience better, right? There's little bits on Twitter, little bits on Facebook, not much. I also think that we haven't yet seen real market competition around harassment rates, right? I think this is where I definitely agree with you. I mean, I think to some extent, people should have a wide choice about whether they're willing to accept a little more or a little less harassment. And when we've actually seen this work a decent amount on search. So we don't actually talk much at all about Google search. That's partly because it's dominant for lots of other reasons, but it's actually very different when it comes to hate and all the rest. You have a way different experience, but you can go into Google search, unlock the default, and get the Wild West, right? But they've done a really good job of taking it responsibly and coming up with a middle ground and competing on that. I would not let my kids use Bing or DuckDuckGo, not just because they're not as good from a search perspective, but also because I'd be concerned about the results. So I think we're going to hopefully see that kind of market pressure, but I think overall we just haven't focused on harassment as much.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's also, and I think the findings that you are talking about, we find some of those things echoed here and what people are concerned about. Many of the content moderation policies within, different platforms or organizations, a recent report from some of my colleagues at CTAP at UNC found are mostly like race neutral or identity neutral. And I think that's a problem. We know that people from marginalized groups are harassed or attacked or bullied at far greater rates than those from a more dominant sort of identity within any particular place, right? And so, they make I think a pretty affirmative case for having not colorblind or identity blind moderation policies around harassment and bullying, but to have them that are designed, specifically to protect and make it easier for those who are, marginalized in a society to be able to report that. I'm a woman on the internet. I'm a pretty privileged woman on the internet because I'm, a white lady and I'm a professor, but I'm still a woman on the internet. And my experience on Twitter, for example, is very different than those of my male colleagues. And that's just one example, but, having tools that take that into account, I think would improve people's experiences and, foster more of these spaces where people feel safe then to have civil conversations, right, of the type that we've been talking about.
So Adam, you alluded to this idea of choice in sort of the experience that you're having on different platforms. There's, of course, a raging debate and legal battles about the extent to which there is competition in the social media market, et cetera. I'm not hoping to settle that today, but perhaps Barak, you can touch on this. To what extent do you think users have a choice to both choose a platform, but also to influence their experience on that platform to try to address some of these issues that we're talking about?
I mean, it's a broad question. How much choice is there? I mean, obviously there is some choice. As Steve mentioned, there are a number of Twitter wannabes, and maybe they will become the next Twitter. Maybe there really will be some vibrant competition among like services. Now, there has to be a recognition that there are network externalities that serve to really enshrine incumbents. It makes competition on the merits very difficult. It gives enormous advantage to scale and to incumbency. So to some degree, there is choice, but to some degree, the market is not as dynamic as one would like a market to be, and that limits choice. I think a bigger difference, however, is that choice is predicated on available information and transparency. And this is, I think, is a very important point that comes in tension, I think, with Sharon and Steve's first points. There is a lot about social media that's very similar to print and other forms of journalism, but there are also a lot of features that are very distinct and present new challenges both to economic competition and also to democratic governance. Social media is not transparent. Social media, it relies on virality. Social media, to a large degree, relies on a kind of rhetoric that Sharon was just describing that really is very visceral and very different from other traditional kinds of media. These are differences in in degree, they're not differences in kind. We all know that there are lots of print media and other kind of television journalism that does capitalize on virality, that does capitalize on our animal instincts. But I think Adam's suggestion about a Google search in many ways illustrates part of the danger or part of the power that these internet platforms have. When you do a Google search, you really don't know what algorithm is being used. Adams has exercised some more trust in the Google algorithm than the DuckDuckGo algorithm, and maybe there's a reason for that. But these are real-time events that are very, very hard to police. And that, I think, is a general statement about social media. Users do really not know what kind of algorithm is filtering their own information. And that is worrisome when there are 3 or 4 algorithms in the world, Google's, Facebook's, Twitter's, that are enormously influential over the kind of information that individuals have. I think Shannon is right that it's very hard to change people's minds, but it's not hard to change their emotions, at least on a very immediate scale. And this is the kind of power that I think is really unusual and presents new challenges. So yes, consumers have some choice, and they probably have more choice than conventional language tends to give them. But there are certain elements where choice is really very difficult and certainly imperfect, and those need to be recognized, especially if there's a potential to have an impact on democratic outcomes.
So you touched on virality. You know, for a long time, certainly in Washington, although I'm sure the panel beat some lawmakers to this punch, but a lot of the debate was around the individual decisions and the actual policies at some of these companies. But we've seen a shift, more focus on questions about amplification and design and algorithms. How much do you think our attention should be on those issues rather than focusing on content policies? And I'll open it up. Yeah.
And I'm anxious to transition to what Barack can present with respect to the notion of middleware. But I can assure you as a programmer for 40 years that the transparency into the algorithms is not going to be all that pleasing. The algorithms used to return your search results or the feed you have on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube is about engagement and relevance as measured by the click and dwell time of the users and the extent to which we share or search for things that are similar. So I guess I've just revealed the big secret that it's all about engagement and relevance because they're just businesses. Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are in the business of making money. Samuel Johnson once said, "Seldom is a man more innocently engaged than in the making of money," because you know exactly what they're all about. The companies are trying to keep the advertisers happy and to keep the users happy because we only get paid if the advertisers show a lot of ads to the users. Because think about it, the services are free. So Google search is free. So I don't think that there's much to be learned from the algorithms that would surprise you. And there isn't much in those algorithms that would regulate very much. But there's plenty of danger in an algorithm that amplifies interest and engagement over really provocative and potentially dangerous content. And that is why our companies need the ability to identify what is potentially really dangerous to your own safety, dangerous to public safety, and to identify them as quickly as they can and to take them down in an atmosphere where at least half the country says, no, that needs to stay up. We need to question the efficacy of a vaccine. We need to organize a big protest, despite the fact that people may bring guns. So it's a tough place to be on that, but engagement and relevance are what drives the algorithms. But I'm sure you have a better solution.
Should I get into it?
Yeah, sure. And I see Shannon's eager to jump in.
Just a quick point is that I don't think we can really disambiguate them. Content and the algorithms, right? We can only understand what's happening in our experiences online if we understand both of those things, right? So for example, we're talking about search. It depends what you're searching for. My colleague at CTAP, Francesca Tripodi, has a book coming out about just this, about search and in particular on the right. And what she finds is that, this is not shocking, but there has not been a lot of research on this so far. The type of words, literal words, right, that you put into search, even if it's around the same topic, give you vastly different search results, right? And this is one of the many ways that people end up in spaces that are hateful and that are filled with misinformation and that are, sharing information that is designed to denigrate the lives of other people and the health of our democracy. And so I think, again, but those results are being given to them algorithm, right? So it's like, it's not just the content or the algorithm. I think it's important to think about how those interact with one another when we think about what are the types of solutions, that might give us a little relief in this area.
Yeah, and just to build on this and go back to Barack, your point, which is the transparency one could have to make user choices or for legislators to make legislative choices or regulators to make regulation choices really varies, right? On one extreme, you've got, I would call it like clear content policy, like is this okay or not? You can also measure fairly easily to what extent moderators do something when you reactively flag it for them. Generally, it's way worse than you'd expect. Algorithms end up, and amplification ends up on the other extreme of that. And that's scary because it's really hard to figure out. And I don't mean algorithms like Google search where there's some, but like, does YouTube recommend, there's the whole rabbit hole sort of discussion around YouTube, right? If you start searching for Trump, do you end up with far-right extremist stuff? That was casually referenced in an op-ed. It took us about a ton of money, a partnership with an academic institution to get users to put plugins in their YouTube to finally understand that it's much more nuanced, right? If that step is required, we're already failing on content policy and content moderation. We are going to fail so massively on amplification, but it is where I think there's a lot of middle ground to give people user choice and all the rest. So I'm scared about that area because it's much harder.
Brock, do you want to explain your concept of a middleware and how that might address some of these issues?
Sure. And it needs to be said that this was I think the revitalization or an additional articulation of a fairly old idea. This is not anything that we were not the first to develop this idea. But as I was intimating it before, the concern that we had was the ability for a small number of individuals to control an algorithm that had widespread impact. And we don't know if it changed any electoral outcomes. We don't know if, some of the tragedies in Sri Lanka or in Myanmar would have happened anyway were it not for the spreading of viral misinformation. But there certainly is a recognition that there's a potential. And if, in fact, the algorithm is the source of power, then that really should be the source or the focus of the regulatory intervention. Now, we approach it not just sensitive to the constraints, the appropriate constraints of the First Amendment, but also very much within a perspective that we want market forces to work, not only to encourage the economic merits of competition, but also to reflect the variety of preferences that users have. So what we recommend is the introduction, and this would be very specific, this would be a different kind of intervention for each platform, and it would only be warranted to target what we would consider to be dominant platforms, but effectively it would be to allow individuals to bring in their own algorithm. Now, individuals obviously aren't programmers, but our suggestion is the development of third-party algorithms, which we call middleware, that individuals would be able to use to insert into their feeds. So there would be an option on your Facebook feed that I want the middleware provided by CNN, Fox News, my local school district, the Washington Post, maybe even Cristiano would have his own middleware product himself. These are things that technologists tell me. I'm not a technologist. These are things that are not difficult to construct. But they would influence the order of your news feeds. They would offer some kind of labeling services. There could be significant interventions or they could be light interventions. It would influence the outcome of certain Google searches. It would influence perhaps also the outcome of product searches on Amazon. Maybe that actually targets more of an economic source of power than a political one, but nonetheless, the same technology would be there. So the idea would be that individuals using third parties would be able to insert a filter into their feeds. There would be more democratic control over what the feeds would be. Mark Zuckerberg and the directors of Meta would not be able to singularly dictate what everybody would see. It would be more subject to a dispersed, decentralized internet. And also, there would be competition among middleware providers for quality. So there would be more confidence that Adam would have that the search algorithm that he's using really is getting what his kids want because it is a product of the marketplace. So that's the general frame of the proposal.
Yeah, and I mentioned that in the early 80s, I was doing programming, and it was something similar to what Barack's describing. I was writing connectivity software between to be honest. But nonetheless, I needed deep and wide access to the mainframe databases in order to return and retrieve what it was that the user was looking for. So my underwear had to know that I had permission to get a look at everything. Well, fast forward 40 years, who do you trust to give access to your entire database? Especially if it involves a lot of personal information, like every single tweet, every single YouTube posting, every single Facebook posting. I guess you could trust a university professor. Oh, unless he turns around and sells it to Cambridge Analytica. That didn't work so well. And in the environment of post-Cambridge Analytica, it's a pipe dream to believe that the big three social media sites are going to simply open up their entire database to people with academic good intentions, because the best of intentions sometimes go awry. They cannot, in the pro-privacy era that we're in, decide to do that without putting privacy at risk. So I support the idea completely. I'd love to see it succeed. But let's be realistic here. The companies themselves can't be in a position of opening up new risks if they have to open up to other people's access. There are third-party tools available today, and the companies that I represent have their own. Safe Search is a middleware switch, an on-off switch. It doesn't give you as much customization and control as I think Barack would like. Restricted mode under YouTube won't show videos that YouTube thinks are inappropriate for children, and you can turn that on in your household or you can turn it off. But again, you don't get to affect what is it about violence that dictates. I do want to point out something that I heard about yesterday. It's a product called NewsGuard. I think it costs $5 a month. But NewsGuard will flag items that you receive and websites that you access as being trustworthy, sketchy, untrustworthy. I don't think there's been enough take-up of that yet as an opportunity, but we can flag things for you to look at and decide. And then the next logical step is you would turn your middleware to say, I don't want to see any of this sketchy or untrustworthy, and just filter that for me. But keep in mind that for you to be able to get access to everything that's on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, in order to filter the things you want, those three companies have to be able to host everything that you may want. And if they host things that are potentially defamation, potentially dangerous material, maybe your filter didn't show it. But if Adam's filter does show it, he's going to be mad as hell that it's still there. All right? And I would conclude by suggesting that don't expect those middleware filters to have access to information that is potentially going to drive lawsuits against the companies, unless those companies are protected from those lawsuits. And you know that's what Section 230 is, because every panel in Washington has to mention Section 230 at least
I'm
once.
amazed it took this long.
Christiana, can I just briefly say, so Steve's concern is a totally legitimate one. The way we envision middleware is not having access to data at all. It's being a filter on what the feed is. In fact, actually, NewsGuard is a great example. It's a terrific product. That actually is simply just a plug into your browser. It doesn't touch the It doesn't touch the Google algorithm at all. It doesn't touch the Google database at all. It's just a label that you plug into your Chrome or to your Firefox, and it doesn't have access to any data that's proprietary, and therefore can't share any. There are versions of middleware that would not just be a plug-in to the browser. There are versions of middleware that would actually be integrated into the platform itself, but it wouldn't require any access to sensitive data. And that's nothing that we would propose either.
And I did want to quickly prime that I'm going to leave about 10, 15 minutes at the end in case anyone has any questions for audience. So if you hear anything interesting and you want to follow it up, start getting those ready. But so this discussion has touched on sort of a central tension here in Washington, and perhaps we can shift a little bit to discussions about regulation and legislation, which is the extent to which some of these things could be addressed through, sort of voluntary steps companies can take, industry collaboration, and to what extent it's something that could be required or enforced by regulators. And Steve, you'd mentioned earlier something to the effect of not necessarily thinking that there's a role for government in sort of shaping design decisions and some of these things that we're discussing. So I mean, what is the role, if any, that government could have in sort of shaping how some of these design choices, algorithmic implications, these things could be addressed? Is there a role for that?
There is, but it's subject to the First Amendment. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law to infringe the freedom of speech.
And that includes Texas and Florida, too.
Believe it or not, it does. Because Congress shall make no law over 200 years, Barack, means no government can do any law or policy that infringes the freedom of expression of private entities. And those private entities were initially, 250 years ago, they were the newspapers. And now they are the newspapers, the broadcast, radio, Cristiano's Washington Post, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. They are private businesses. So no state or government can pass a law telling them what content they have to carry or what content they have to take down. I thought this was pretty simple, right? But I'm parachuting into Austin, Texas this time last year, and the chairman's running a bill in Texas that would make it illegal for Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to suppress any expression that was submitted by a user if it was permitted by the First Amendment, and if there's any lawful contact. And that includes anti-Semitic screeds. It includes nudity, pornography, vile forms of hate speech and disinformation that our platforms don't want to have, right? So we would not be able to have that anymore. And I think that was the whole point. They wanted to punish our platforms for taking down what we thought was really violent and dangerous content around January the 6th. So I was talking to the chairman about this, Cristiano, and he's going on about how this bill is just what we need to solve social media.
This is Chairman Pallone, yes?
This is in Texas.
Oh, in Texas.
In Texas. So remember, here in Washington, the left and right kind of cancel out. That's why you don't see a lot on your beat on real effects to do anything on 230. So please join me in the states, Cristiano. It's a mayhem. It's a circus. There's 50 states. They run 2,000 bills a year. That's 100,000 bills a year. And a shitty idea can become a law in about 2 weeks. So it's crazy. And I said to the chairman, Mr. Chairman, could you pass a law that would force the Austin American-Statesman, their newspaper, to force them to carry your op-ed? He said, of course not, First Amendment. I said, so why do you think you could force Twitter to carry your content? No answer. And on party lines, it passed. And after it passed, NetChoice did exactly what we told them. We sued the state of Texas, just like we sued Florida, obtained a very quick injunction where a judge, federal district judge, says, no, you can't enforce this law. It's a blatant violation of the First Amendment. Both states appealed. And in the case of Texas, their appeal to the Fifth Circuit, 2 of the 3 judges on that panel said, well, we don't think it deserves an injunction. Let's let it go to trial. So we immediately appealed emergency form to the U.S. Supreme Court in May of this year. And we got a majority opinion telling Texas, no, you cannot enforce this law. And that means that it meets a very high bar. It means that it's likely to be held as unconstitutional. That isn't going to stop it from happening in multiple states. We will see bills in 25 states next year, still continuing to do it. Why? Because that's how you appeal to a base. It's a political exercise. The governors of Florida and Texas were appealing to Trump voters. They didn't actually want this bill to pass.
So one pushback to that argument that I've heard from policymakers, not just in Washington, but also in the states, is that, some of these proposals that we're seeing, and I'll refer to a few, but they're not trying to target speech, they're trying to target some of the design and the amplification. So a couple examples are the proposal in California dealing with kid safety that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but would basically try to tie harm caused by algorithmic amplification to children, or try to tie some liability to that. There are proposals in Washington dealing with that as well. And then we've also seen, efforts like the UK Age-Appropriate Design Code that I think those policymakers would push back on that assertion. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's clearly, based on both, at minimum, the First Amendment, but also I think our free speech principles in this country and just politics, significant limits on what we can do legally here. I think there's a set of things that we clearly can do, right, that would help quite a bit on certain areas, not all, right? So things like some of the California transparency bills, so increasing of your transparency. What do you take down? What don't you take down? Response to complaints or victim services, things like that.
Or appeals, too.
Yeah, or appeals, right? There's a whole bunch of procedural things that I actually feel like would solve a lot of what I called early on, like the easy questions. I then think there's this separate set, right, of things like increasing liability when it is an illegal action that you connect with, right? I think that I think are worth in doing as well. And then there's a set of things that we're not. And I think that's the set of things that we're going to have to rely on shaming sort of lower P politics and market pressures to hope, as well as, interesting tech solutions to solve. But the idea that we should abandon laws doesn't make any sense. And there is a bunch that I think we can and should do quickly.
So you touched on transparency. There are also some proposals here in Washington. There's a proposal by Senator Coons, PATA, which would basically require platforms to disclose some information potentially about their algorithms. They're designed to researchers, and it's a process that would be sort of overseen by the Federal Trade Commission. There are, of course, aspects of this to the Digital Services Act as well, and as you mentioned, there are some efforts in the states. So, I mean, what are some of the pros and cons of that approach? Are there limitations to, well, let's figure out what's going on, let's get more information, let's get more sunlight on some of these issues?
I would say that you're not going to be very pleased with the sunlight on algorithms for reasons I mentioned earlier. But I'd enjoy a little bit more sunlight on the moderation decisions. When they happen, why did they happen, which particular rule did I violate, what do I have to do to change the content to get it back up? So more of that would be useful. Why don't the platforms do it now? Because it gets gamed by those who want to know exactly what word do I need to take out of this inflammatory video in order to get it back up. It happened to me yesterday with a doxing concern on Twitter. So the more information that is disclosed to actors who want to game the system just makes it easier for them to play. And keep this in mind, things change, circumstances change. When we learn about a new health threat or security threat, the algorithms aren't going to change, but the content moderation policies are going to change instantaneously. They can't require a 30-day notice like some of the laws have required before we change the content moderation policies. And total transparency is going to be after the fact and not before.
Shannon, you look like you're eager to jump in.
Yeah, well, but I do think transparency, and in particular, from those outside the companies themselves, right? I'm a researcher. I have worked with data that has been made available by some of the platforms, even with like the differential privacy sort of added in. Obviously, those things are important. It is very hard to make a lot of sense of that data, and it has been an arduous process to even get it. But I do think compelling transparency, even if it's after the fact, right, you're talking about, is really important, right? I mean, we're sitting up here with a journalist. Transparency is important. Understanding the impacts of things is important. And having, compelling platforms or organizations to have some type of reporting or transparency that then outside actors, academics, researchers, journalists, civil society organizations can take up and report findings, right, and report this is what's going on, that gets into then the public pressure. It also, I think, is very helpful, from what I understand from my friends that work at some of these companies, very helpful internally as well, right? To have research from the outside looking at different things than might be driven by inside research, to be able to say like, oh, wow, maybe we should be moderating this type of content differently, right? This is not something that we had thought about. So I actually don't, I think designed properly, something like this is really helpful for both having sort of that public pressure driven by actual real information based on transparency and research, done with some of that information. But I also think, done well, it's a benefit to the companies as well, right? To have that sort of outside look at what's going on. So that's where I see at least like the most bang for the buck in terms of some of this, because I think so much more of it is so fraught. Yeah. And even, other types of regulation that I might support that I think would, establish a healthier, sort of communication from like a healthy democracy perspective, it's not going to happen, right? And so where can it happen? Like, I think you're so right. Like, there are some easy questions that I think we should be able to address in a much more expedient manner than we are at the particular moment.
If Shannon's law were to pass, would the Washington Post, after the fact, have to give transparent reports on all the letters to the editor I've submitted and why you didn't run it, or why you didn't run Barack's op-ed? Because it's the same thing. It's content that was submitted that didn't get posted. It was declined. And I mean, you might say, fine, the Washington Post might be glad to list all the things that it accepted from users and decided not to run.
I guess I would say there are a handful of details that need to be worked out on each one of these things. First, I would say that isn't a parade of horribles, in my opinion, necessarily, that I'd be worried about. And two, again, we're not going to get perfect here. We should recognize where we are, and also recognize that I think we are willing to tolerate some kind of speed and refinement and ongoing refinement of the procedural stuff, because we know we are not going to touch the substantive. The net effect of this will likely be some kind of sort of unintended consequences on procedural stuff, increasing the cost a little bit of starting new social media companies, something that, given the profitability of being a successful social media company, doesn't feel that crazy to me. But overall, I think a lot of these, there are lots of little glitches and issues that we need to resolve, but we're starting at such a low level and know that we can't get too high.
The rest of the world has another solution. They don't have a First Amendment. So in the rest of the world, they could declare that Nazi paraphernalia is illegal, that declining, saying that the Holocaust didn't happen is a crime. So Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube around the rest of the world have a much more broader set of unlawful stuff that they take down the minute they're identified, or else they're going to be liable. In the US, we have almost nothing that you can say that's unlawful. Only a tiny little fraction of, threats of physical harm and harassment. Everything else is lawful, even though a lot of it is awful. So we have a unique set of constraints here.
Yeah, it's I wasn't going to bring this up because I'm not a First Amendment scholar, but it is interesting. We have a very particularized jurisprudence in the First Amendment and this is not just a creation of the Roberts Court. This is also a product of some seminal decisions in the 1990s. You could imagine a First Amendment jurisprudence. In fact, we had a First Amendment jurisprudence prior to 1990 that was much more amenable to addressing social harms, had a much more circumscribed understanding of what speech is. The current court views speech to include things like the sharing of electronic data. And that precludes all sorts of interventions, including the lightest touch, including perhaps even transparency. A transparency rule could be deemed to be a forced speech and therefore unconstitutional. Now, if in fact a transparency law is deemed to be unconstitutional, is there consensus that advances First Amendment principles? I don't think so. I think there's a very, very vibrant debate over whether that's actually pro or anti-democratic values. But we have to recognize that there are lots of ways to interpret the First Amendment. lots of good ways to interpret it, and the current court interprets it in a certain stylized way. And that might more severely limit the kinds of interventions that we're talking about than we realize. By the way, I do think that middleware nonetheless would pass through the current court, but very few others will.
So there's some really interesting legal questions, and I wish we had another hour to dig in. I did want to turn it over to the audience. If anyone had any questions, I believe, do we have someone running around with a mic? Okay, great. So you can just raise your hand, and someone will come around to you.
Thank you. So my question is to get kind of beyond content moderation. We talked a lot about content. What about the fundamental kind of data that feeds into the algorithms that is used to make this decision? Could we think about regulating, this has been a very Americentric, I would say English-centric discussion. We know that there's way worse disinformation in Spanish. There are 7,000 languages. Only a handful have any good natural language processing AI capabilities. So to what extent should we be thinking about beyond content moderation, mandating better data, better machine learning from more languages, greater oversight beyond just after content is posted? Because it does seem that despite the title of the session, there is a focus on kind of what the content ends up being. And similar to that, the type of data that can be collected and therefore used to design these systems. A lot of the problems here is about the design of systems that encourage engagement and what is engaging more extremist type of speech. Thanks.
Anyone want to take that?
I could give you one point. Courtney, nice to see you again. I could give you one point that amazed me. I was meeting with some of the Google engineering people who were lamenting the fact that the database of knowledge at Google is so English focused. And they said it's because there aren't enough translations of the material to languages other than English. And they're doing their best, even though they get sued sometimes for copyright when they scan and publish books. They're doing their best to move that along. But a mandate wouldn't be as important as incentives, and the incentives should come from the market. If Google is serving markets that don't use English and the Latin script, as those markets achieve certain scale and scope, there ought to be sufficient incentive to spend the money to achieve translations of material to languages other than English. But I don't know how a mandate from the government, and maybe that's not what you were suggesting, but the markets are driving it now, and if you want to juice the market, it's easier to do it with incentives than a mandate that would have a hard time surviving a First Amendment problem.
But you mentioned Myanmar. That wasn't like a big market for them. So how, given they're global in these markets that do not have the ability to create market incentives. Somalia is not going to create market incentives. How do we get beyond content moderation, beyond the Americentric, the fact that these companies are shaping politics and genocide in other countries? And so I am asking whether we can regulate that, create greater barriers to entry, mandate that if you're going to go into another market that you have to have certain, protections in place, that you have to have certain oversight, or that you have to have, capabilities in given languages, et cetera.
It'd be hard. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Shannon.
I think this is a huge problem, and I think it goes back, into like even the training of people who end up in the rooms making these decisions, about prioritizing certain, types of languages or certain, certain ways we're making decisions around, algorithms and other platform designs, which is that it is, primarily white, primarily very elite in terms of like socioeconomic status. And I think so addressing that problem, I think, is also a problem of like going all the way back, to like funding diversification in education in these areas as well, so that there are native speakers of some of these other languages getting engineering degrees in the room, like when these decisions are happening. This is just one example. I could think of a lot of other types of people that are like in the room making some of these decisions as well, not just around languages. But I think, one way to get around content, to get beyond content moderation like you're asking, is to really be thinking about how can we diversify the sorts of people that are trained to be in the position to make these decisions, what kind of different lived experiences and, cultural knowledge can we get in the room so that there isn't as, it isn't as much a dominant ideology or dominant presence built into the design of a platform, built into the design of a moderation system, for example.
Other questions?
Hi, sorry, right here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Helen Zhang from Google. So, Adam, I think it was, thank you so much for your comments about Safe Search. I promise I didn't pay him in advance.
There was a great study on it.
Yes.
Quantitatively.
Yes. We can talk more about that later. But my questions for the panelists is that in content moderation, particularly in info integrity space, so disinfo and misinfo, we've increasingly seen some fledgling democracies use the sort of guise of cracking down on info integrity to really perpetrate their own, or push their own political agendas. So for example, in Brazil, in Indonesia, India, I would just like to hear your views on this particular emerging issue. Thank you for the panel, by the way, it was great.
I mean, I'm not the one to comment on that, but I'll just point out that the first two questions are two sides of the same coin. One expresses concerns about what Facebook is doing to Myanmar, and the other expresses concerns about what Myanmar is doing to Facebook. Mm-hmm. And both are totally legitimate concerns.
That's right.
I just want to reiterate what Shannon said, which is what I interpreted as, that bifurcated choice, we shouldn't accept that those are the only two choices. Either the generals in Myanmar control Facebook or Facebook can control Myanmar. We have to recognize that this is an unusual kind of product, an unusual way of spreading information that has significant effects on civic behavior and democratic outcomes or political outcomes. And we have to view it somewhat circumspectly. We have to realize that the model itself, the product itself, can be improved upon. Middleware is just one, but I think what Shannon said about the way that engagement can be produced, the way it can open up other voices, there has to be an alternative path to either we trust the company or we trust the dictator.
So I think we had time for one more question. Rick had his hand up here. If we could.
Oh, go ahead, John.
So we have one online question from David Sullivan of the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, who asks, what can the industry as a whole do in the absence of action on Capitol Hill and with too much action in the states? And he has a shameless plug that he has an upcoming report on this. So have fun with that 1 minute about left to answer that great question.
We poll Americans every 2 or 3 months and spend a fortune on it. And when you list the things that Americans are concerned about with regard to the country, technology isn't even in the top 10. It's not even above the margin of error. They're worried about supply chain, worried about inflation, worried about immigration and crime, healthcare. And then when you ask them hard about technology, no, just focus on technology. What do you care about? Market concentration, less than the margin of error. Number 1, 2, and 3 are security and privacy of their data and understanding that they're not going to be victims of identity fraud. So what should Congress do, John? They ought to be working like crazy to pass good privacy legislation, put some teeth in it, eliminate a state patchwork so we don't have 50 different state privacy laws, and find a way to have Americans feel more confident that their data is going to be secure and protected.
Any other quick thoughts before we wrap on that?
I also think that, given we've had a robust discussion about how much First Amendment protection, the platforms and companies have. And so they could use that to take stronger stances on saying, we want the content on our platform to look a certain way, and we're going to prioritize, for example, democratic norms or equity, right, as something. Like the companies have absolutely First Amendment protection to make different decisions, and I think take stronger stances than they are currently in many cases, to say, actually, we're going to design our platform to be a space for democratic health, and here's what that's going to look like. And if you don't like it, then you can go somewhere else, and the market will and has already, given solutions for those issues.
I think if industry wanted to, they could address a ton of the easy questions. They've done it before on certain types of content, even when it wasn't illegal, whether it's spam or other things like that. And so they could do it. It'll still be hard, and there'll still be plenty of room to compete.
So unfortunately, we are out of time, and we're running into people's coffee time, and I don't want to take that away. But so thank you so much to our panel. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Cristiano. Thank you both.